Reuters reports that the operator of the wrecked Fukushima nuclear plant took the first steps today in the long and hazardous process of decommissioning the facility. They extracted 4 fuel rods from the container for later removal. Tokyo Electric Power Company, known as TEPCO, said it transferred the rods to a steel cask within the same cooling pool. It begins the delicate and unprecedented task of removing 400 tons of highly irradiated spent fuel from the reactor. With me is Arnie Gunderson. He's chief engineer at Fairwinds Energy Education. They try to demystify nuclear power. Thanks for joining me, Arnie Gunderson.
Hi, thanks for having me.
First of all, can you kind of set things up for us here? Remind us what is going on at Fukushima. They had 4 reactors, and this was the one that wasn't turned on, so you would think that it was the one that would be easiest to deal with.
It is the one that's easiest to deal with, which makes this truly frightening because it's such a difficult project. The nuclear fuel is stored in a fuel pool. It's not much different than your swimming pool, except it's 50 feet deep. And at the bottom of the pool are racks where the nuclear fuel is stored. Now, back in 2011, when the plant had an earthquake, the plant shook so violently that almost 4 feet of water sloshed out of the fuel pool. So think about your swimming pool moving sideways so violently that 4 feet of water slosh out of it. So that was the beginning of the problem. The fuel racks at the bottom of the pool were damaged by the earthquake. But then, worse than that, shortly after, the building had an explosion. So the roof fell in on the fuel racks. Now, I used to build fuel racks, and the tolerances are very, very high precision. And if they're damaged if the fuel is in them and the rack is distorted, it becomes extraordinarily difficult to pull the fuel out. Almost like a pack of cigarettes, you can pull the cigarette out pretty easily unless you distort the pack, in which case it becomes really hard. So the problem facing the people at Tokyo Electric on Fukushima Daiichi Unit 4 is that, 1, the rack was distorted by the earthquake, and 2, the roof fell in on what was left and further damaged the rack.
And right now they're trying to go in there and get some of the worst fuel rods that were possibly damaged.
Well, right now they pulled the easiest fuel rods, the least problematic of the fuel rods. There were about 20 or 30 brand new fuel bundles in there. A new fuel is new iron. It's not brittle. It's very ductile. So they're trying this attempt on the new fuel, which means that it's the least likely to have problems, because it wouldn't have been in a nuclear reactor for up to 4 years. So it's not anywhere near as brittle. So they're practicing this week and perhaps for the next month on these new fuel bundles before moving to the really difficult stuff.
How is this different from moving fuel bundles, which TEPCO does all the time? Because it seems like they've taken a lot of extra precautions here. They've built an esophagus. They've built this crane mechanism inside the esophagus that's doing all this work. But is that a lot different than regular?
Well, and actually they're doing it out at Zion right now. By the way, near you, the Zion nuclear plant is moving fuel.
And this is something that is common. Everybody puts their fuel rods out in these pools. This is where you store your spent nuclear fuel all over the place.
Correct. So the storage of nuclear fuel and the removal of nuclear fuel from a rack is something that's done. Like you can't say day to day, but certainly on a yearly basis, fuel is moved in a nuclear fuel rack. The problem is maybe threefold. First off, these racks are no longer as designed. They've been beat up by sliding side to side in the earthquake. The second off is that they have rubble in the rack, and the third piece had to do with the building. The building was structurally compromised. It was there was at least 2, if not 3, explosions in the building, so that there was no envelope over top of the fuel pool, and it was exposed directly to the air. So what Tokyo Electric had to do was put in a new crane on the existing old foundation in order to do these fuel lifts, and then they covered it all in essentially a shrink-wrap building that was constructed in the last 9 months or so. The purpose of that building is so that if they break a fuel bundle, the radioactive gases are not released at the ground level, and they run through filters before being released up the stack. So the building is designed as a containment envelope to release radiation up the stack in the event that they break one of those fuel bundles.
Is that the worst-case scenario, breaking a fuel bundle?
Well, there's 2 worst-case scenarios. First off, though, they have to do this. My problem is really with Tokyo Electric doing it as opposed to it has to be done. The building is structurally compromised, and Unit 4 worse than the others because it has more nuclear fuel in it. So it's not something that can be delayed by 10 years or something like that, because the threat of an earthquake is significant, and in a compromised building, it could really cause a serious radiation release if the building were to collapse. So it's important to move the fuel. There's no doubt about it. But the 2 problems are snapping the fuel as they lift it out. And that's happened here in the States. Periodically when you go to pull a bundle out, it gets distorted and it breaks. And inside are radioactive gases, particularly krypton-85, that are released into the atmosphere. The other problem, though, and this is unique to the Fukushima site, modern fuel racks have boron in the surrounding the nuclear fuel. And the boron at Fukushima Daiichi likely leached out over the last 2 years for 2 reasons. The water was very hot. It was boiling. And this boron was never designed for boiling water. And on top of that, because they ran out of normal cooling water, they had to add salt water. So the boron wasn't qualified for salt water, and especially hot salt water. The boron prevents a chain reaction from occurring in the fuel pool. So what Tokyo Electric has had to do is add the boron to the water, because there can be no confidence that the boron plates that separate the fuel are any good anymore. If the fuel gets too close to each other, it can cause a chain reaction in the fuel pool. Now, the fuel pool isn't designed to handle that kind of heat. So what they would have to do is very quickly, if they start to see local boiling, because you would begin essentially to run your nuclear reactor in the fuel pool, they would have to quickly push the rod back into place and hope that the chain reaction stopped. And that, of course, assumes that the rod can be pushed back in. The problem here is that with the distortion of the racks and the rubble, the friction on these bundles can be significant. And as they start to pull them out, they can get stuck, so they won't come in or out, or they can perhaps be pulled out, but perhaps not be able to push back in the event of a problem.
Arnie Gunderson's chief engineer at Fair Winds Energy Education, and we're talking about the Fukushima nuclear plant and moving the fuel rods in and out. The process began today at Reactor 4. So the reactor, if it goes into one of these, where it kind of gets to the free, what's the term you use? Where
inadvertent criticality.
That's it. What happens then?
Well, the problem in my mind is that Tokyo Electric hasn't thought that through. In my opinion, they should have 2 things. They should have excess boron in liquid form that they could rapidly add into the fuel pool in the event that a chain reaction did occur. And the other thing is they should have a lot of excess water in the event a chain reaction occurs to make up for what could potentially boil off. And this is where an experienced engineering firm would have more checks and balances than what Tokyo Electric presently has. They've been underfunded for the last 2 years. The Japanese government is trying to do this on a shoestring, and they're demanding all the money come from Tokyo Electric. So what they've done is they've stripped funds from their other reactors in order to keep funding Tokyo Electric's Diaichi site. But the net effect of that is that they haven't had the right manpower. They haven't had well-paid enough people to attract high-quality people, etc. So we're in a situation now where they're trying to do it themselves rather than rely on the international expertise that's out there.
Now, I read a quote from Lake Barrett. He's a former U.S. nuclear regulatory person who was involved in 3 Mile Island, and he said that he'd been invited by TEPCO to review their contingency plans, and he found them thorough, and he said, I'm not trivializing what's an important operation, but the technological safety risk of moving the fuel is very, very low, and I believe they're ready to go.
I know Lake Merritt. I worked with him back in the 70s, before 3 Mile Island, and he's being paid by Tokyo Electric to make that assessment. I think you have to keep that in mind. Also, on the 3 Mile Island accident, he was basically the government spokesman, and that quote could have been 20 or 30 years ago as well. But I think the risks are significant, especially with Tokyo Electric doing the work. Like I said at the beginning, it has to be done. This isn't something that should wait a year or 2 or 3. But the unfortunate thing is that I don't think the operator has put in enough contingency management. In the event things go bad, there's not enough contingency there. I was in Tokyo last year, and I got to question Tokyo Electric about the Unit 4 fuel pool. And I found that they were woefully unknowledgeable about the problems that spent nuclear fuel can have. It was in the diet, which is their parliament. And in questioning them eyeball to eyeball, I found their staff to just not appreciate the magnitude of the problem that they were facing.
Now, this is a problem that's going to go on for a full year. They anticipate it would take them a full year to get the rods out, and it could take more.
They have another, at Kashiwazaki Kariwa, which is their other big nuclear plant. They have 8 nuclear reactors on the Sea of Japan. It experienced an earthquake about 5 years ago, and they never got some of the fuel out of the fuel pool because it was so distorted that they couldn't pull them out. So I think they're going to find the same thing here. They'll pull some bundles that will come easily, and then, they've got to have a plan B in place that when the bundles don't come out, what's the next step? And I think they'll have to create some remote cutting techniques, so the rack would have to be literally cut apart around the nuclear fuel in order to release it so it can be moved. And again, that's one of those areas of expertise that I don't think Tokyo Electric brings to the table.
Arnie Gunderson is Chief Engineer at Fairwinds Energy Education. Thanks a lot for joining us and talking about what's going on at Fukushima.
Thanks for having me.
A new challenge today for the operator of Japan's Fukushima nuclear plant. Today, it begins removing highly radioactive fuel from one of the damaged reactor buildings. The Japan Atomic Energy Commission has described Fukushima as an unprecedented crisis which is getting worse. And Japanese officials have recently admitted that many of the 160,000 people evacuated from the disaster zone may never return home. The Vice Chairman of Japan's Atomic Energy Commission has been in Brisbane for an energy security forum. Professor Tatsujiro Suzuki spoke with our reporter Kathy Van Extel.
One of the biggest impact of the Fukushima accident, loss of public trust. Still, the polling suggests about 80% of the public wants to phase out nuclear power eventually. But currently, the government is having an expert panel, advisory council on energy, discussing the future of energy policy in Japan. They are supposed to publish the report by the end of the year. So far, the discussion is now divided, but probably they will agree for restarting up the existing reactors. But for the future, long-term future, it's not clear how they're going to agree.
So no clear vision about an expansion of the industry?
Probably not.
Looking at Fukushima itself, the most dangerous phase of the decommissioning process is currently underway. Mm-hmm. Engineers, as I understand it, are extracting something like 1,300 nuclear fuel rods from one of the reactor buildings. One slip could result in a monumental chain reaction. Are you nervous?
Yes, this is one of the most difficult tasks that they are going to just start this week or next week. And hopefully this will be done very carefully. Given
TEPCO's record, though, are you putting unfounded faith in the organisation?
Well, they are very good in this spent fuel removal. They have been doing this for a long, long time. Although this is a challenging task because this is not a regular operation, but the removing a spent fuel itself, they have been doing for a long time. So this is better than managing contaminated water.
Well, let's talk about the radioactive water. Yes. The site, of course, continues to be plagued by leaks from the radioactive water going into the ground and into the Pacific Ocean. The government's now stepped in with plans for a very expensive, giant underground frozen wall to be built around that site. Mm-hmm. It's a risky experiment, isn't it?
Yes, but we have to do it anyway.
There's no options?
There are options. There are other options they are considering right now, but that seems to be probably the quickest option they can introduce so far. But the more difficult issue is, of course, how to store all the water, and water is leaking from the storage tanks, and they will replace with the more better tanks. And eventually, we have to remove the radioactive material from the water, and they have to release to the sea. So in order to do that, we need to get the consent from the local fishermen industry. That will be more probably difficult.
I read somewhere that there's actually a looming storage crisis at the plant, that the water and soil that's contaminated, you're running out of space. Right.
That's a very urgent task. They have to build more storage tanks.
There has been a lot of work in trying to decontaminate the evacuation area in order for people to be able to return to their homes. Indications are that that's a long way off still, isn't it?
For the first 1 year or so, the contamination level goes down very quickly. But after that, it's a stay. So the government has to decide pretty soon how long will it take and how much it's going to take to go down to so-called regular standard level, which is 1 millisievert per year. But they're going to take a long time. So whether the residents are willing to come back, even though it's a little bit higher than the regular level, but could live there, the health effect is not so significant. So how much you are willing to take a risk, and how long they are willing to stay outside, how much they are willing to come back. That's a more social decision to make.
The uncertainty and distrust that is there, that's going to be a difficult task, isn't it?
It is a difficult task. My personal opinion is that Japan doesn't have much good policy-making process involving the public. And so far, only the head of the minister talking to the head of the town doesn't involve much the regular citizens. So we need to reflect more public opinions for decision-making process.
Is it the case, though, that for some of those evacuees, and there are many thousands, tens of thousands, that a lot of them aren't going to be able to go back, that it's not going to be a reality?
Yes, some of the towns, maybe it's very difficult for them to come back for a long, long time. But the area is shrinking for those who cannot come back. So hopefully in the next year or so, the town residents can discuss this with the regulatory authorities, and they can decide to come back. I
would have thought that the key issue for a lot of those residents in this place is that they need compensation.
That's correct. The law is now going to be revised, I think, to help the residents who decided not to come back can be also compensated. The problem is not just individual compensation, that the social infrastructure are not ready yet, like hospitals, schools, those kind of things. So it's a catch-22 situation. So you have to carefully craft the plan to have a so-called reconstruction of the town.
There's been criticism of the government that there's been not enough done on that area.
That's true. And there's a strong mistrust between the public and the government. It's going to take a long time, I think, yeah.
Just talking about the extraordinary expense of the decommissioning of Fukushima, which is going to go on for decades, some experts are suggesting that Japan should be considering other options, including the tactic that was used for Chernobyl of simply capping. Is that an option?
Under the existing law, that's not the option. All the bills go to TEPCO. As you said, some suggested that's probably too much for TEPCO. And also, in order to help the victims and also the decontamination process move faster, the government should pay some of the cost. But then you have to change the law, and you have to draw the line how much the government will pay. So the LDP just published a report to recommend the government to change the law to divide the responsibility between TEPCO and the government. And I think the government accepting that proposal and now going to discuss how to change the burden of the responsibility.
That's Tachijiro Suzuki, the Vice Chairman of the Japan Atomic Energy Commission, speaking with Kathy Van Extel. He was in Brisbane for an energy forum organised through the Griffith University's annual Australia-Japan Dialogue. It's 17 to 7 on Breakfast.
Hi, Arnie Gunderson here. We've had a surprise walk-in visitor here to Fairwinds in Burlington. His name is Matt Noyes, and he's an assistant professor at the School of Business Administration at Meiji University. We're glad to have him here today. He's a very knowledgeable American with a Japanese perspective on what's happening in Japan today.
It's nice to say. I'm very happy to be here. Fairwinds has been a crucial source of information for me over the last few years and really invaluable. And so it's a really tremendous pleasure to be here.
When I woke up on March 11th, the accident was already underway. You know, it happened at 2 in the afternoon in Japan, which was in the middle of the night in America. So I woke up, and at 8 we knew there was a big earthquake. And by 9 there was comment that the State Department was involved in getting batteries. And when I heard that, I knew the very first day that there was going to be a meltdown. And the reason is that these huge pumps that cool the plant can't run on batteries. And that told me that the cooling pumps were wiped out, and the secondary source of cooling the plant, all these remote battery-operated valves and things like that, were running out of power. I told Maggie, I said, I'm going to devote today to staying on top of this. We had the New York Times call and Washington Post call and Wall Street Journal call and all that stuff. By Monday, CNN had called, and I was asked to be an expert on John King USA. I had seen my government cover up 3 Mile Island. And actually, back in the day when that happened, I was a nuclear executive, and I was on television telling people there's nothing to fear. Well, as I learned in the 1990s, 15 years after the accident, there was something to fear in that the government had lied to me, and then I had lied to other people about the impact of TMI. So I said to Maggie, I'm not going to let that happen again. And by Monday, you could see the nuclear industry and the Japanese government all lining up. I said, I am not going to lie to the people of Japan like my government lied to the people in America. So that's how Fairwinds started. I said to Maggie, I don't care what this means personally, but we can't let this get covered up like 3 Mile Island was covered up. And this is much worse than 3 Mile Island. And unfortunately, it's becoming a much worse cover-up as well.
Well, I was on the street getting ready to leave I was going to take a flight to Portland that day, so I was going to take the train from Shinagawa Station to Narita Airport. Standing in the middle of the street, and the earthquake happened, and it was bigger and longer, and just, shaking these concrete telephone poles and walls. Everything was just moving around us. It was bigger than anything I'd experienced, and I had lived there, I guess, about 8 years at that time. We went home first to see if anything was damaged, and some things had fallen down, but nothing too bad. So then I went to try to go to the train station, and lights were off, people were pouring out, no trains, no power. And then I tried a bus, and they told me Narita Airport was closed. No airplanes, no power. Everything was just shut down. Went back home and then started to get the news about what was going on. So first was just the actual tsunami news, the earthquake, and then the tsunami news, which was so astonishing to see, just whole villages completely wiped out. So that was bad. But then Fukushima, I don't remember exactly how I realized how quickly it was that the Fukushima issue came out, but it was pretty quick. So I went upstairs in my house and got online. And so I started Googling it, starting to get news. And I would, really, you're soaking up news like crazy at that point, especially as soon as we realized that there was the meltdown possibility at that time, we were told. Actually, not even fact it was told. At the beginning, it wasn't even likely, not possibility, but very unlikely scenario. But I would go, and then I'd be looking on the news, and then periodically I'd go downstairs where my wife was watching TV, and something would come up on TV, and it would be obvious to me, like, this was just not true. I'd just been reading news about something different. And she's Japanese, so she's watching the Japanese news channels. And then later, what would happen is I would come downstairs and something would come on the news in Japan as breaking news that happened, that was news internationally a day before, 2 days before. A good friend of mine, was called the news gap, is how people describe this, journalist friends of mine did. And so a good friend of mine who's an excellent interpreter was asked by an Australian news team to come with them. They wanted to drive up to Fukushima, and they needed an interpreter. And so he's in the car with them, and he's listening to the radio. And so he would tell them news, just coming off the radio. And the Australians were like, oh, yeah, of course, we know that already. Is there anything new? So he was shocked. The news gap was so distinct. So this continued for months. There was just a complete gap between the global coverage of Fukushima and the local. And I found that not only was the global coverage sort of more frank or more honest, it often it was just more accurate and more informed. They somehow, I don't know exactly how, but through ways that people have basically a lot of it was analyzing the design of the plants, which is why your broadcasts were so great. Here we're getting information about what is the design of these reactors and what does it mean that you lose cooling in this area or that there is a steam explosion in this area. How do you read that? And then particularly the question about detonation or a deflagration, a distinction that I learned from you. All of that information was coming from outside Japan and not from inside Japan at all. While you were doing those broadcasts, the Japanese government was telling people that the things were, they didn't say stable, but they said, of course, there was nothing to be afraid of, there's nothing to be worried about, there was very unlikely that there would be a meltdown. That turned out to be the news well after they knew the meltdowns had happened. But the news they stuck with their story that meltdowns were not going to happen. That was really one of those things that's sort of shocking and offensive. Japan had a long-standing anti-nuclear movement. So there are a lot of people who immediately recognized what was going on, and and their reaction, of course, was to be completely offended by this and outraged by what was going on. On the other hand, so that's one kind of layer of people. Another layer of people were young people, a lot of young parents in particular, who were afraid. And a lot of them are people who did have access to some sort of international news, and they were picking up that there is a huge distinction between what they're being told by the government, and the news media in Japan was essentially what was being said by the government was what was reported. They would do a news conference from TEPCO officials or government officials in front of this press corps, no follow-up questions. So a TEPCO person could say, the measurement is X, and nobody would ask, well, how do you know the measurement is X? Is that measurement everywhere, or is it just in the one place that you measured? Or what does that measurement mean? How is it? They don't follow up anything. They just take it at face value and move on to the next question. This was going on, but some people were disturbed by the kind of news gap and the problems there. They became a big part of the new anti-nuclear movement. which kind of was very different than the old movement, kind of very different composition. And then the really difficult and frustrating part is a lot of people tried not to think about it. And that's still going on now. It's amazing how much people don't want to think about it, don't want to hear about it, don't want to talk about it.
Yeah, that's the advantage. When you put something in the air that's going to kill you 20 years from now, you've got 19 years that you don't have to worry, the cancer statistic.